What if every flood isn't just a whim of nature? What if heat waves, hurricanes, and snow in the middle of summer aren't accidents? Today, we'll take a look behind the scenes of a global game where the elements become weapons and the weather becomes a tool of pressure. Who controls the climate? And why are they keeping it a secret? This investigation could change the way you look at the sky. Humanity has become accustomed to thinking that weather is a chaotic force of nature, uncontrollable by humans or machines. Lightning, rain, droughts, hurricanes. All of these seem to be manifestations of the eternal and unchanging mechanisms of the planet, beyond the reach of human understanding. But at the end of the 20th century, and especially in the 21st, this certainty began to crack. More and more evidence suggests that weather can be controlled, and perhaps it already is. Climate change is no longer just sudden. It has become precise, targeted, too convenient, as if nature has ceased to be random. Heat waves are destroying crops in a country whose economy depends on grain exports. On the same day, in another hemisphere, torrential rains are flooding the only logistics hub connecting Asian markets with Europe. Sounds like a coincidence? Perhaps. But when there are dozens of such coincidences, when hurricanes always hit economically important regions and droughts come strictly during the harvest season, the question inevitably arises, what if someone is pulling invisible strings? What if the weather is a new weapon? The question of climate weapons has long ceased to be the stuff of science fiction. It was first raised in the mid-20th century. Back then, during the Cold War, when the US and the USSR were competing in every technological field, the idea of controlling the weather began to take shape. It would seem that interfering with the atmosphere is a daunting task, impossible to achieve. But it was at this very moment that the first experiments began on artificial precipitation, cloud control, and even attempts to change the trajectory of hurricanes. All this was called experimental meteorology. However, military goals were hidden behind scientific terms. The goal was simple: to use nature as a weapon. If you can make it rain over a battlefield, you can stop a column of tanks. If you can extend the rainy season in the jungle, you can hinder the movement of guerrilla fighters. And if you can cause a drought in a specific region, you can destroy agriculture and the economy without firing a single shot. This kind of warfare leaves no evidence, causes no public outcry, and requires no parliamentary approval. It is silent but deadly effective. But the problem with climate weapons is not just the technology, it is their accessibility. Unlike a nuclear bomb, climate intervention does not require extremely expensive materials. All you need is knowledge, equipment, and access to the sky. This means that if the technology exists, it can be in the hands of anyone, from a powerful state to a private corporation. Or worse, a transnational group operating outside national borders. Today, we hear about abnormal storms that come out of nowhere. We see drought in one area and flooding in the next. We are experiencing temperature fluctuations that do not fit into natural cycles. And all this is happening against a backdrop of growing interest in geoengineering, a science that directly deals with influencing the climate. It is no longer possible to simply dismiss this as a conspiracy theory. There are too many facts, too much evidence, too many documents and patents. There are too many coincidences, too many instances where the interests of political and economic players align too precisely. Climate weapons are not science fiction. They are a reality that people prefer to ignore for now. Because to acknowledge them is to acknowledge that someone has a button that can bring about the apocalypse. This chapter is just the beginning. Next, we will follow the trail of experiments, secret projects, missing scientists, and technologies that seem to exist, and then suddenly disappeared. We will try to understand who could be behind this silent but powerful weapon, and why they need it. In the second half of the 20th century, the idea of changing the weather ceased to be a utopian fantasy. It became part of scientific laboratories, military reports, and even government programs. It all started with harmless and even useful intentions: to induce rain in arid regions, disperse hail clouds, and reduce damage from heavy downpours. The first experiments were carried out under the banner of combating weather threats. However, it became clear early on that by controlling rain, you control life. One of the most well-known methods was so-called cloud seeding, spraying reagents into the atmosphere to promote moisture condensation. Silver iodide, carbon dioxide, liquid nitrogen, all of these were released into the air from planes or rockets, and within hours, it would start raining. In some cases, the results were stunning. Flowers began to grow in the desert, and entire bodies of water appeared in regions that had not seen precipitation for a long time. But behind the beautiful pictures lay a serious problem: interference with the natural balance. No one knew exactly how atmospheric processes would react to such manipulation. Sometimes the rains did indeed fall as planned, but sometimes hurricanes, floods, or, conversely, prolonged droughts began. And all this happened without any way of predicting the consequences. It was as if nature was beginning to resist. In the 1960s, the military took up the idea of weather modification. They saw it not only as a means of saving people from natural disasters, but also as a potential strategic advantage. A famous American project called Storm Fury was launched in an attempt to influence hurricanes and divert them from their paths. The attempts were mixed, but the idea itself showed that the government was seriously interested in climate control. The Vietnam War attracted particular attention. In the mid-1960s, suspicions arose that the United States was using cloud seeding to prolong the rainy season and hinder the movement of enemy troops. These rumors were long considered a myth until the early 1970s, when documents confirming the existence of Operation Popeye surfaced. Its goal was to cause torrential rains over tropical trails to make them impassable. The result? Months of mud, downpours, and logistical paralysis. After that, the UN adopted the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. However, the question remained: if the climate had once been used as a weapon, could it be guaranteed that it would never be used again? In parallel with military projects, the civilian sector conducted its own experiments. China actively developed rainmaking programs for agriculture. The USSR also conducted large-scale research in the field of climate modeling. The topic was particularly active in mountainous areas and steppes, where precipitation directly affected crop yields. But here, too, problems began to arise. Rains fell where they were not expected or were too heavy. International scientists increasingly sounded the alarm. Every intervention in the atmosphere is a game of roulette. We are setting processes in motion without understanding the entire chain. This means we are risking global consequences. But these warnings were often ignored, because if there is a technology that can be used for control, it will be used. And the more opportunities there are, the greater the interest from those who seek power. Thus, Ideas that began with a desire to help nature have gradually turned into a way to subjugate it. And that means subjugating all of humanity. When it comes to climate weapons, it is impossible to ignore one of the most mysterious and controversial projects of the late 20th century: HAARP. Behind this name, which sounds like a technical code, lies a whole layer of theories, suspicions, and, possibly, technologies that have changed everything. Officially, HAARP is a research program aimed at studying the Earth's ionosphere. But, as is often the case, there is more to it than meets the eye. HAARP stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It was launched in the early 1990s in Alaska as a joint effort between the U.S. Navy and Air Force, the University of Alaska, and a number of private contractors. At first glance, the project was transparent. Scientists were going to study how high-frequency radio waves affect the upper layers of the atmosphere. However, the details raised questions. The main installation of the complex was a powerful transmitter capable of directing concentrated beams of radio waves into the ionosphere. These waves, interacting with charged particles, can create heated areas, a kind of lens in the sky that reflects or refracts other signals. All this was used for communication, surveillance, and, according to some claims, even to influence the weather. Critics of HAARP claimed that the installations were capable of changing the trajectories of air masses, causing precipitation, or, conversely, dispersing clouds. The most radical claim was that HAARP could influence the planet's magnetosphere and even cause earthquakes. Of course, officials denied everything, but documents, patents, and the behavior of nature told a different story. For example, during the period of active HAARP operation, there were frequent reports of strange phenomena. Northern lights appeared in unusual places, radio communication failures were recorded, and abnormal weather phenomena were observed in some areas. All this happened simultaneously with peaks in the activity of the complex in Alaska. Moreover, at one point, mass protests began. Activists accused the U.S. government of using HAARP as a climate weapon disguised as a scientific experiment. Interestingly, the project was eventually officially shut down in 2004. However, a number of independent sources claim that its functions were transferred to new, more modern facilities in other regions. In particular, Greenland, Antarctica, and even eastern Siberia were mentioned. Mobile complexes located on offshore platforms were also mentioned. None of these facilities have been confirmed by documents, but coincidences, as we already know, can be very telling in such matters. What makes HAARP special is its scale. Unlike local cloud seeding experiments, HAARP is capable of influencing global processes. It does not simply make rain, it has the potential to change the structure of the ionosphere, a layer that plays a key role in protecting the Earth from solar radiation and in the functioning of all communication systems. This means that in skilled hands, this technology becomes not just a weapon, but an absolute form of control over the climate, information, and, possibly, consciousness. This makes HAARP not just an object of interest, but a symbol of the whole topic of climate weapons. Scientific reports, military patents, political games, and the fears of millions have become intertwined around it. And while some continue to insist that it is just a scientific station, others see it as a window into a world where man has become the god of the weather. If HAARP is the anchor of climate weapon theories, then the spraying of substances into the atmosphere is their wings. Over the past 20 years, The term chemtrails has become practically a meme associated with tin-foil hats and fringe groups. However, beyond the sarcasm lies a very persistent concern. What if certain trails in the sky are indeed linked to geoengineering, the deliberate manipulation of the climate? Let's start with the official version. Geoengineering is a scientific discipline that deals with modifying climate processes to counteract global warming. One method is to spray aerosols, most often sulfates, into the upper layers of the atmosphere to create an artificial umbrella that reflects the sun's rays and lowers the Earth's surface temperature. In theory, it's a life-saving measure. In practice, it's interference with the planet's delicate balance. Conspiracy theorists claim that spraying is already happening, on a scale that is difficult to imagine. They cite hundreds of videos showing planes leaving wide, long-lasting trails behind them. These trails are not just condensation, they say. They are a thin veil of light-reflecting particles that settle on the ground, cause allergies, and alter the microclimate. And indeed, in areas with frequent chemtrails, there has been an increase in respiratory diseases, bee deaths, and weather anomalies. Interestingly, discussion of such phenomena is not uncommon in closed meteorological forums. Some meteorologists admit that there are weather anomalies that cannot be explained by classical science. Moreover, various patents, and this is public information, mention technologies for dispersing particles from aircraft to control the weather. The goal is to cool the atmosphere, cause precipitation, or neutralize radio emissions. Sounds crazy? Perhaps. But then the question arises: why are these projects not being discussed officially? Why are geoengineering experiments often conducted without public debate? And most importantly, who controls the process? A number of studies indicate that some of the spraying projects are controlled by private corporations working with government agencies. This means that the climate, a strategic resource, is in the hands of commercial entities. It is not surprising that there are speculations that those who conduct the tests may be behind some environmental disasters, without asking permission from billions of people around the world. In the 2000s, the issue of spraying substances became a topic of discussion at European Parliament meetings. Some MPs said outright that there was evidence of weather manipulation. But, as is often the case, it all came to nothing. It is too difficult to prove. It is too convenient not to notice. Meanwhile, the sky above our heads is changing. Smooth, perfectly intersecting lines, trails that do not dissipate for hours, strange milky clouds. All this has become part of our everyday landscape. We look up, but we don't ask questions. Or we ask, but we don't get answers, because perhaps those answers lie higher, at a level we cannot reach. Climate is not just a natural phenomenon, it is a resource. And everything that can be considered a resource eventually becomes a commodity and a tool of pressure. In the 21st century, control over the weather is turning into a form of geoeconomics. And if wars were once fought over oil, gas, and water, today there are increasing signs that a struggle for control over the atmosphere has begun. Weather disasters have come to coincide with the financial interests of large corporations and governments. Imagine the situation. A drought begins in one country. Crops die. The economy suffers. At the same time, another region receives accidental rain, restores its harvest, and increases exports. The balance in the global market shifts. Who wins? Those who can direct the clouds, literally, Global agricultural giants are increasingly turning to climate startups. These companies offer precipitation management, hail protection, and guaranteed weather during harvest time. Some even openly state, "We cannot control the weather, but we can increase the likelihood of the desired scenario." In essence, this is insurance for the future, where the stakes are not only on the market, but also on the atmosphere. The cooperation between such startups and transnational investment funds is particularly worrying. Climate risks are becoming part of stock market strategies. And if you can influence the climate, you can influence share prices. This means that billions are at stake. This creates a temptation to use technology not to save the world, but for profit. There are many examples of weather disasters suddenly occurring in countries that have only just begun to increase exports of competitive products, or in those that have broken away from the control of large global alliances. Economic isolation through weather is not a hypothesis, but a hypothetical practice that can no longer be ruled out. Financial analysts are increasingly considering climate as a variable in political forecasting. Special weather threat indices are even emerging. Banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, all are closely monitoring climate fluctuations. But the question remains, are they just observing, or are they themselves involved in creating them? A term has even been coined, weather speculation. It is used to describe the practice whereby major players know in advance where and when a climate anomaly will occur and use this knowledge to enrich themselves. For example, they buy up certain assets in advance, place bets on futures, or even leak information about an upcoming storm to crash the market and profit from the rebound. In such a world, nature ceases to be an element. It becomes a manageable asset, and those who control this asset gain a new type of power. It is not the power of weapons or capital. It is power over the very foundation of life, over the climate. And the more this power is concentrated in the hands of a small circle of players, the greater the risks for all of humanity. Because in such a game, everyone except those pulling the strings may lose. And if we don't know who controls the weather, then it has already become a weapon in the hands of others. When the conversation turns to climate weapons, many perceive it as something hypothetical and unprovable. However, there have been cases in history when weather was literally manipulated as part of military programs with clearly defined goals and documented results. The most famous of these is Project Popeye, implemented by the United States during the Vietnam War. This is not theory. It is a historical fact. The project started in 1967. The goal was simple: to artificially intensify the rainy season in the Ho Chi Minh region to make the supply routes of the Viet Cong troops impassable. Planes were used to spray silver iodide over the clouds. According to reports, rainfall increased by 30%, trails turned into swamps, and the movement of goods became almost impossible. This was the first recorded case of climate modification being used in combat. This fact caused a storm of reaction in the international community. As early as 1977, the UN adopted the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. But who said that the experiments stopped after that? There is circumstantial evidence that military programs in this area continued, but under the guise of scientific or meteorological research. For example, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union ran the Typhoon program, which aimed to model the weather over the territories of potential enemies. China also conducted parallel developments, especially in the context of the 2008 Olympics, when the sky over Beijing was cleared using climate engineering. It is interesting that technologies originally considered purely scientific are beginning to move into the dual-use category. Devices designed to neutralize hurricanes can be used to intensify them. Precipitation control systems can be used for targeted flooding. Moreover, patents filed in the United States in the 2000s explicitly describe the possibility of controlling weather conditions to protect or destabilize specific regions. One of the most alarming documents was a U.S. Air Force report entitled "Weather as a Force Multiplier: Owning the Weather in 2025." This document states that by the middle of the 21st century, the United States should have technologies that allow it to own the weather as a factor of dominance on the battlefield. This document was published on the official website of the Air Force and was available to the public for a long time. Does this mean that a new generation of climate operations is already underway? There is no direct answer to this question. But there are facts. The disappearance of researchers, strange weather anomalies in conflict zones, unusual coincidences in weather data, and military reports. All these details add up to an alarming picture. The climate has become an arena, quiet, invisible, but deadly dangerous. And even if no one officially admits to using weather weapons, their shadow already looms over many events of the last decade. After all, if the technology exists, someone is bound to use it. History shows that there is always a small step between the creation of a weapon and its use. And it seems that this step has already been taken. While debates about climate control are unfolding on Earth, technologies that allow weather to be controlled not from the ground, but from space are attracting increasing attention. Satellites, lasers, orbital mirrors. All of this is no longer science fiction, but the subject of real developments and patents. A new level of control is forming above us. The sky under control. The first and most obvious element of this system is satellites. Many are already in use today, both civilian and military, to monitor climate change. But some of them, according to open patents and documents, have the ability to exert a directed influence, changing temperature zones, reflecting sunlight, focusing electromagnetic waves. Such satellites are, in essence, becoming instruments of geoengineering on an orbital scale. The second element is lasers. In the early 2000s, reports emerged about the development of orbital lasers capable of ionizing the upper layers of the atmosphere, creating condensation points for clouds. These technologies, developed as part of military programs, were officially described as communication and navigation tools, but their side effects may well include microclimate change. The third category is the so-called mirror satellites. Projects such as Starshade or Sunshade are being developed with the aim of partially reflecting sunlight to combat global warming. But if such designs fall into the hands of those who pursue political rather than environmental goals, they could become a global switch. Imagine if a region could be deprived of sunlight for days or weeks. It would be a blow to energy, agriculture, and the economy. And all this without a single explosion. In addition, there are reports of orbital platforms with microwave generators. In theory, they could heat up certain areas of the atmosphere, changing the trajectories of cyclones or causing rapid evaporation. These platforms have not yet been publicly confirmed, but they are mentioned in reports by some independent researchers alongside HAARP as part of a broader climate control system. Another vector is ionospheric heaters, similar to HAARP, but located in different parts of the world. Some experts suggest that such stations are already operating in Greenland, Canada, China, Norway, and even Antarctica. Linked into a single satellite coordination system, they can create effects that were previously impossible. Changes in the density of the ionosphere, effects on the magnetosphere, and interference with electronics and radio communications. All of this is not theory, but a subject of discussion in technical documentation and military doctrines. And the most alarming thing is that most of these developments are in the hands of military structures and private contractors, not democratic institutions. This means that there is virtually no public control over them. We do not know where they are deployed. We do not know who presses the button. We do not even know what goals are being pursued. And that is the main horror. Because if the sky is really already under control, who controls the controller? At first glance, it might seem that if climate weapon technologies really existed, everyone would know about them. After all, the world is transparent. Information cannot be hidden. However, this is an illusion. History has proven time and again that the most important technologies rarely become public knowledge in a timely manner, especially if they confer power. Especially if they are capable of destruction without firing a shot. One reason for the silence is that climate technologies are classified as dual-use technologies. That is, they can be used for peaceful purposes, meteorology, communications, navigation, as well as for military purposes. And anything that has even the slightest connection to military interests is automatically shrouded in secrecy. Classified patents, closed scientific publications, contracts with private contractors, the whole system works to make access to the truth as difficult as possible. Moreover, many large international organizations have a vested interest in not inflating this issue. Take, for example, the World Meteorological Organization. It collects data from around the world but rarely comments on geoengineering issues. Or the UN, where the topic of climate weapons is raised only by a few countries as part of the security agenda. The main argument is, there is no reliable data. But how can there be data if research is classified and scientists who dare to speak out suddenly disappear from the radar? Silence is enforced not only from above, but also from below. In the scientific community, talking about this means risking your reputation. Any hypothesis about chemtrails or artificial storms is instantly dismissed as conspiracy theory. Funding is lost, articles are not published, grants are frozen. Scientific consensus is formed not only by facts, but also by the fear of being rejected. And then there is the commercial interest factor. Private companies that own the technology are not eager for publicity. Their business is exclusive control over the climate. And if they cooperate with governments, it becomes part of agreements that are classified for decades. Therefore, anyone who tries to get to the bottom of the matter is faced with a lack of information, confusing connections, and outright pressure. Journalists who have attempted to investigate climate weapons have repeatedly reported surveillance, threats, and sudden blockages. Some media outlets that previously published such material removed articles without explanation. Some websites where this topic was discussed suddenly disappeared from search results. This is not just silence, it is active suppression. And finally, the most important reason, the very nature of climate weapons allows them to leave no traces. If there is a downpour, who can say that it is artificial? If a hurricane has turned in the wrong direction, how can this be proven? Abnormal heat? Flooding? Everything can be blamed on climate change. It is a convenient cover that always works. That is why no one talks about it. because it is the perfect weapon, invisible, inaudible, uncontrollable. And that means that acknowledging its existence could mean acknowledging the vulnerability of the entire world. And no one is ready to do that yet. Every year, we hear news about another natural disaster. A hurricane that hits a densely populated region at incredible speed. Torrential rain that turns European streets into canals. Snowstorms in deserts. Or heat melting asphalt in Siberia. These events have become so frequent that we have begun to perceive them as inevitable, as another symptom of global warming. But what if it's not that simple? There is a view that some of these disasters are not accidents, but the result of intervention. Too often, anomalies coincide with political instability, economic interests, and military operations. Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana the day before major military exercises. The floods in Pakistan coincided with negotiations on access to strategic resources. The drought in South Africa coincided with protests against large corporations. Coincidence? Or warnings? No one talks about it directly. The official version is climate change, but in a number of cases, data on these disasters disappears from the archives, or is edited, or suddenly becomes classified. At the same time, independent meteorologists trying to compare hurricane trajectories and atmospheric emissions have been denied access to satellite data. Why? Some scientists suggest that we may be witnessing the consequences of hidden climate wars. These are not open hostilities, but demonstrations of power. If you can cause a disaster without naming the culprit, it is the perfect means of pressure. The country finds itself in crisis, but no one is shooting. Instead, they negotiate. Or they give in. Particularly suspicious are so-called pinpoint disasters. Situations where a single city or district finds itself at the epicenter of an unpredictable and isolated disaster. Moreover, the recurrence of these points raises questions. Why there again? Why only there? Geographical coincidences with economically significant areas, transport hubs, industrial centers. All this is alarming. But the most striking thing is people's reactions. Mass disasters are perceived as acts of nature, and few people look for a deeper meaning. This is beneficial to those who can manipulate the weather. No investigation means no one is to blame. No accusations mean no responsibility. Only humanitarian missions, drone footage, and images of destruction. Of course, it is impossible to claim that every storm is provoked, but it is also impossible to prove the opposite. This means there is room for action without consequences. This is what makes climate weapons so dangerous. They can be used, and the perpetrators will never be caught. While we search for a logical explanation for natural disasters, someone can use them as blackmail, or as a demonstration, or simply as training. And if that is true, then every drop of rain may not be a blessing from nature, but a message that no one has read, but that someone has sent. So, if the weather can really be controlled, who is doing it? Who is behind the technology, patents, installations, satellites, platforms, doctrines, and silence? The answer to this question is complex, multi-layered, and perhaps the most disturbing. The first level is obvious. These are states with scientific and technical capabilities, military infrastructure, and money. The United States, China, Russia, and possibly some European countries. They have the resources to launch climate programs for both military and civilian purposes. Their agencies conduct research, launch satellites, and build facilities. This is the level of legal control. But there is also a second level, which is less transparent. Private contractors. Companies that work for the state, but are not directly subordinate to it. They have their own goals, their own owners, and their own sources of funding. It is through them that shadow projects most often take place, classified, with vague wording and technical documentation that only specialists can understand. The third level is international consortia. These are networks of institutes, research centers, and technology platforms working under the banner of combating the climate crisis. They receive grants, hold conferences, and publish research. But some of them are too closely intertwined. They are financed by the same banks, supported by the same foundations, and their leaders are former Secret Service officials. This is an infrastructure of influence that goes beyond national interests. The fourth level is the elites: financial, political, ideological. Those who control funds, governments, corporations. They don't have HAARP installations in their backyards, but they control those who do. They don't press the button. They give the order, or they simply hint. And that's enough. The fifth level is the most alarming. These are forces that cannot be traced. Groups that are not registered anywhere. Technologies that are not listed in catalogs. People who do not appear in the news. They may be linked to intelligence agencies, or corporations, or religious orders, or those who live outside official history. Their goals are not necessarily money or power. Perhaps it is ideology, or an experiment, or simply playing God. Whoever is behind climate weapons, one thing is clear. This is no longer a hypothesis. It is a reality that no one asked us if we wanted to enter. We are now inside. In a world where rain can be an order and a hurricane a sanction, where the weather is the language of power. And while we continue to argue about global warming, while scientists discuss the limits of its impact, while society argues about trails in the sky, decisions are being made without us. And we feel the consequences of these decisions on our own skin every time we look up at the sky, because someone is already looking down on us and controlling us.